Hello everyone, this is Andrew. Welcome to Keen on America.
On July 4th, 2026, America will be 250 years old, an anniversary that will, no doubt, be greeted with a mixture of celebration, contemplation, and resignation. In Keen on America, Andrew talks not just about the American past and present, but also speculates on its future. What, Andrew asks, will be the 21st century fate of this now venerable American Republic?
Hello everybody, it's Monday the 10th of November 2025. A couple of days ago we did a show with my old friend Andrew Hill from the Financial Times. He's the organizer of the FT Best Business Books of the Year, and we talked about the 6 books on the shortlist, but there's only one story, and that's the story in some ways of the closing of the American century. All the books on the FT Book of the Year this year are either about the rise of China or the decline of the United States. One book perhaps captures it more than anything else, a book by Dan Wong called Breakneck, China's Quest to Engineer the Future. It was reviewed by my old friend at the FT, John Thornhill, and he interprets it as a book about why China's engineers beat America's lawyers. My guest today on the show is an expert on American law. He is, on the one hand, a lawyer, a man who spent his entire career, a very distinguished career as one of America's leading lawyers. He's associated with the firm of Covington. I think he's one of the founding partners. But on the other hand, he's been a critic of American law. A lot of you will remember his book, The Death of Common Sense, How Law is Suffocating America. It was a New York Times bestseller. He's written another book called Life Without Lawyers, Restoring Responsibility in America. I'm guessing it's also Life Without Him. And he has a new book out. Came out a month ago. It's called Saving Can Do, How to Revive the Spirit of America. And I'm thrilled and honored that Philip K. Howard is joining us. Philip, is the way to revive the spirit of America just getting rid of all the lawyers, purging them?
No, but we do have too many lawyers by some multiple factor. But we do need to get rid of law in people's daily lives and interactions. It's become a form of central planning.
Does that make you a conservative, a form of central planning? Are you reviving the Cold War?
No. I think I offend both sides. I'm not a conservative because I'm saying that officials have to have more authority to use their judgment to give a permit for the transmission line or negotiate a contract for the Defense Department. And I guess the liberals don't like me because one, they like central planning, and two, they don't want to upset their existing interest groups, the public unions and the trial lawyers and all those people. And those are all those armies of people who are invested in the status quo will do anything to avoid the kind of reform I'm talking about.
Well, I'm not sure that's entirely true. One of the other books on the FT Book of the Year is Ezra Klein and Derek Thompson's Abundance, which is like your book about reviving the spirit of America. They're writing as progressives, and I'm not sure they would necessarily fit into your category, which makes their book an interesting one. What exactly, Philip, is in your mind the spirit of America? Is it a can-do spirit?
Yeah, I think it's a spirit where people wake up and they have a sense of ownership of their daily choices. They can do things in their own way. They can vent. They can make judgments about other people's character. They can, they can associate with people who have similar interests within broad boundaries, and mainly they have the self-esteem that comes from human agency, not being kind of people on a legal assembly line, complying with the rules all day long. And And we've lost that. I mean, just to give one obvious example, anybody who works for a big firm has to go to mandatory video training, the upshot of which is basically don't be yourself. Don't be spontaneous. You might offend somebody. Somebody might feel unsafe, all that kind of stuff. The result of which is perfectly counterproductive. Everyone knows that people are withholding what they're really thinking. And so all it does is breed distrust.
And of course, it also sparks the growth of this self-help movement, which encourages people to read and write books about being authentic. But as you're suggesting, perhaps the law or the culture or the economic culture, at least in America, discourages authenticity. Is that fair, Philip?
Yes, it does.
So how could this have happened in an America where, whatever one thinks of the country, it's certainly a can-do country, a remarkable 250-year history of doing stuff, of industrialization, of landing on the moon, of the Cold War, of certainly winning the Second World War and helping to win the First World War. What has happened in very brief terms?
Well, first, it isn't completely gone. In areas that are not regulated, which included the tech sector until recently and now includes artificial intelligence, there's an enormous amount of innovation and can-do attitude. So I think that's the exception. But there's a clear history of what happened, which is that after the 1960s, we woke up to abuses of racism and pollution and other things, and we needed to change our values, and we did. We anti-discrimination laws and environmental laws and such. But the legal geniuses at the time wanted to make sure there would never again be any abuses of authority. So they actually changed the operating system of American democracy from what can be called a human responsibility model, where, as in the Constitution, the law defines the scope of authority and responsibility, but leaves people within that scope, within those boundaries, free to make the trade-off judgments and succeed and be accountable for how they do. It doesn't mean they can do whatever they want. There are checks and balances. Other people can reverse the decisions, but people could use their judgment. After the 1960s, they got this idea that law could be a compliance system. So we never had 1,000-page rule books before, didn't have processes to approve power lines that took a decade, didn't have individual rights to complain about not getting a promotion or whatever. Just one story. In 1956, the Interstate Highway Act was 29 pages long, and 10 years later, 21,000 miles of road had been built. The last Transportation Act was almost 1,000 pages, was implemented by many more thousands of pages, and it takes years just to get approval to build one section of a road.
This is an argument I've heard on this show a number of times over the last few months, one by Yoni Applebaum, the Atlantic writer. He has a new book out called Stuck: How the Privileged and the Propertied Broke the Engine of American Opportunity. Also, Mark Dunkelman, who's an academic and an activist at Brown University, Why Nothing Works, Who Killed Progress, and How to Bring It Back. They're making similar arguments. It was interesting. I think it was in my conversation with Dunkelman. We talked about Ralph Nader. Ralph Nader's an old friend of mine who's appeared on the show. Does Nader, in your view, Philip, kind of capture the rather tragic irony of what's happened, that a progressive like Nader has actually transformed America into this increasingly conservative, can't do culture and economy?
Well, I mean, Ralph Nader, I used to debate him years ago, so we never got along. But but his focus was really giving people the right to sue for anything, which is paralytic and is one of the reasons why people write rules. Because if they have a very clear rule, they can say, well, the rule made me do it, or whatever. But I don't think he's the main cause of this. I think the main cause, which the abundance guys refuse to take on, is an operating philosophy. It's really a shift in operating philosophy after the 60s, and that basically went from human responsibility to compliance. And I was on a program recently with Mark Dunkelman. He and I have done a bunch of stuff together.
He's good. I enjoyed having him on the show.
I think
his book, Why Nothing Works, is an interesting book.
Yeah, it's fantastic, and he's a fantastic guy, very thoughtful. And he sees the genesis of this between, as a kind of conflict between the Hamiltonian idea of a strong central government and the Jeffersonian idea of focusing on the effects of localities and giving more authority to people in localities, which means they can veto things, and so nothing gets built. I think there's something to that, but I fundamentally don't agree. I think the big shift was after the 60s. It was explicitly anti-authority. The historian Eric Foner has said in his book on the history of freedom that after the 60s, we redefined freedom as being the absence of authority. And that's fundamentally, it's incredibly destructive of a free society, because what the geniuses didn't realize at the time is you take away authority, you actually take away everyone else's freedom. So, for example, if the principal of a school doesn't have the authority to uphold standards and values, then what you have is no mutual trust in the school. The energy, it's like letting the air out of the balloon. The energy goes, and people don't feel liberated to do their best, and really the pride of moving forward and educating all these young people.
Yeah, and it may explain why I think you make the point in the book is in Illinois, out of 95,000 teachers, only 2 have been fired. This issue of compliance, some people might be listening, Philip, and thinking, well, this is a bit rich. This guy who's made a fortune as a lawyer all his life is writing all these books against law. Can you get away with that? How can you be both simultaneously a lawyer who's profited from compliance and laws, and also at the same time suggesting that this is what's wrecking the country, this is what is transforming America into what some people think of as a banana republic?
Yeah, well, first of all, I'm not for Trump, so I'm not a Trump supporter.
I'm not bringing up Trump. I haven't mentioned the T word yet.
Okay, but the solution to red tape paralysis isn't top-down autocracy. The reason I don't think it's rich for me to be doing it is because I think the rule of law is designed to enhance everyone's freedoms. John Locke, of all people, said the point of law is not to restrict, but to enhance freedom. And so any sensible rule of law draws outer boundaries against things that are wrong, no pollution, no discrimination, no crime. And within those boundaries, it defines an open field of freedom where people can be themselves, and they can surge, and they can fail, and they can be accountable to other people, a giant marketplace of a free society. That's why law is essential to freedom. Law isn't essential to freedom because we're going through the day with our noses in a 1,000-page rule book.
Philip, listening to you, you suggest that you're maybe neither on the left or the right. I haven't heard a lot of progressive arguments. It sounds rather conservative, almost Burkean. You're treating the 1960s as if it's the French Revolution, and you're arguing that we need to respond to that. It's not necessarily a criticism. There's nothing to be ashamed about being accused of being Burkean. But where's the progressive side of the argument? Aren't you essentially a conservative here, for better or worse?
Anybody can label. I would say that you're correct that people label me. There was a feature about this book in the New Yorker, and the writer labeled me as the conservative thinker, Philip Howard. But I got my start doing this working with Clinton and Gore on reinventing government and writing the introduction to Gore's book on reinventing government. So my focus is all about not getting rid of government. It's about making it work. What does it take for government to be able to modernize America's infrastructure? what does it take for government to run a decent school? I don't think those are conservative ideas. And I get pushback all the time from the libertarians because they don't like the idea of giving officials authority. And I'm saying nothing works if the person with responsibility doesn't have the authority to do their job. I don't think that's a conservative idea.
Should America be learning more then from China's achievement? We've been doing some shows on China's remarkable breakthrough in renewable energy, the fact that they're cornering the market in renewable energy, which will probably make them the dominant power, economic and otherwise, of the 21st century. Can America's lawyers learn from China's engineers? Is that the model for the 21st century? Should we be emulating the Chinese, Philip?
No, Dan, I've written about Dan Wong's book, and he and I chaired an event with him on the panel at Stanford recently. He's great, and the book is fantastic. I mean, speaking of horrifying, the chapter on how China enforced the one-child policy, I could almost not finish reading it. This makes you the brutality of the totalitarian.
It encourages us to go off and make some children of our own, right?
Oh, yes. So in any event, I've done my duty. I've had 4 children. But no, so there's a difference between some crazy spending or Robert Moses doing things in the dark on the one hand, and paralysis on the other hand. And so I've testified before Congress a lot and worked on reforms on infrastructure permitting, which is a lot of what Dan Wong's book is about, and was involved in actually helping achieve some reforms a few years ago for time limits and page limits and environmental review, that sort of stuff. They've made no difference. And the reason they've made no difference to something that the abundance guys don't recognize is you can't prune a jungle that's been written, a legal jungle, to be mandatory. You can cut 80% of it, and what's left says you can't build it unless you've complied perfectly with, satisfying the Native American tribe or whatever you've done a study of historic buildings. And that's the wrong framework of law. If the way it ought to work is environmental review is a good idea. Someone needs to have the authority to decide how much environmental review is needed in a particular project. What are the important issues? Maybe it takes 6 months. It shouldn't take 6 years. It should be 50 pages or 100 pages. It should focus on what's important, not no pebble left unturned. And
so
then,
should we, Philip, should we be idealizing or being slightly nostalgic for someone like Robert Moses? The Dunkelman, I won't say he's nostalgic, but he writes a lot in his book, Why Nothing Works. It's a history in some ways of Moses. Should we be looking back and thinking that? I mean, Moses wasn't a very nice man, but he got stuff done.
Moses accomplished an extraordinary amount. I mean, he was a bull, and he had some terrible ideas and completely wrecked some neighborhoods. But he also did wonderful things. He preserved 100 miles of beaches on Long Island most of which are public. And so he had, in all these parks all around New York, he created bridges that get us back and forth. He built them. So he did good things, but the way to sort of modify Moses is to have a review process where people can use their judgment to focus on what's important to review, so that there's public transparency and therefore political accountability, and then a decision is made that's a political decision. So do the benefits of a transmission line outweigh the cost of building it through a pristine forest? That's not a legal question. That's ultimately a political question. I think there should be transparency. We need to have environmental review, and then we need to have a political decision that's then accountable to the public. That's not how the system works today.
In the Wall Street Journal review of your book, they suggest that your proposals are might be part of the problem. I'm quoting the review in the Wall Street Journal. Ultimately, Mr. Howard proposes to answer today's public frustration with a series of related empowerments. Empower leaders to make choices needed for society to move forward. And they suggest that in a sense, you're falling into the same trap. How are we going to do this, Philip, realistically? You're a man who's been around. You know how things can and can't get done. We can't just come up with more white papers and well-financed proposals and groups, which is only going to dig a deeper hole, isn't it?
Not in that particular part of the review. In another part of the review, he did criticize my proposal to have expert commissions review decisions after the fact instead of having years of process before the fact. And we can talk about that. But empowerment is the opposite of the current system. So if you want to build transmission lines to access renewable energy, in my view, there needs to be a statute enacted that says, notwithstanding any other law to the contrary, the way transmission lines will be approved for the next 5 years is for the following, 4 steps or whatever it is. And that way you can simply sail around the 150 million words of binding federal law and regulation and actually build some transmission lines. And so it's not at all impractical, but it does require change in law. Today, with only slight exaggeration, everything is illegal. 150 million words of binding federal law and regulation, it's not like it's a system. It's not like a bunch of people put together the world's biggest crossword puzzle. It's just layers of law stacked on top of layers of law. It's internally inconsistent. It's well overdue for a spring cleaning. And it ought to be cleaned out, not to get rid of government, but again, to make it work.
Isn't the race already over? The closing of the American century? The American century is already closed. I mean, the Chinese, for example, when it comes to renewables, doesn't matter what changes in the American law, even if they take place over the next few years, the Americans have already lost that race. A lot of people argue that they're already losing the race on AI. Could one argue, Philip, that the race is done, that the American century is finished, that you're really you're writing the funeral oration, not oration for the American can-do spirit?
I think we're talking about two different things. I think China's power, they could become and are becoming economically more powerful. They have, much more renewable energy. They have many more things that we have. They're apparently brilliant at AI. So, whatever our competitive advantages are will be reflected in our economy. But the American spirit, which is what attracts immigrants from around the world here and what makes it a wonderful country to live in, the American spirit is based on human agency. And we've taken that away. Most Americans feel that the future will be bleaker for our children. It's not because China's winning. It's because nobody feels they can make a difference. They can't fix the damn school. They can't, they don't have a sense of ownership for their lives and their businesses. And, I think recapturing our spirit is, to me, I don't know if it's more important than the economic metrics, but it's certainly equally important. And, what are we going to fight for if there's a war? What's the basis of our pride?
Yeah, I wrote a book almost 10 years ago now called How to Fix the Future, which is about the crisis of agency in the United States. So this isn't a new story. Isn't this, though, a political project? I don't want to turn this into another conversation, Philip, on Trump, But can Trump be seen as a response to this? Perhaps not a particularly wise one or an effective one, but his determination to destroy government and just get rid of agencies, not agency itself. How do you interpret MAGA and the Trump movement in the context of your saving can-do argument in this new book?
Well, I think Trump is a symptom. He's a symptom of frustration particularly by people in the heartland, that they're being talked down to, being told cultural things that they don't believe in. And Trump has a feral genius for identifying these idiocies and picking that scab. So I think he's a symptom for it. He's clearly right that the civil service was long overdue for an overhaul and the government agencies don't work very well, but he has no vision and perhaps no interest for how to make things work better. He just wants to tear it down. And that's how he kind of feeds that bitter, that resentment, by his populist base. And all he has to do is keep beating up on people, and he's popular with them at least, but it's not doing the country any good, because what's needed is to not just disrupt it, which I think is a good idea, but actually replace it with something that works.
So how do we do that? You've noted in the book that America is at a moment of great change. I mean, you're certainly not the first or the last person to do that. You're not a MAGA person. I assume you didn't much approve of Elon Musk waving his chainsaw at the cameras. Where do we? I take your point about some of the reforms in law, but if this is going to be captured politically at first, you've really been critical of the Klein-Thompson book, which has been enormously successful amongst progressives. Where do we start for the 28 election? I mean, are there politicians running who have the spirit that you believe is essential in your new book about reviving America?
Well, first of all, just on Klein and Thompson, I think the abundance idea is a really great idea. I'm all for it. They just don't have a vision of how to get there. They think that if you want it, somehow it will happen. That's just not true. I mean, the law doesn't let it happen. And if you go and snip some of the bureaucracy, that's not going to make it happen either. So my complaint is not with their vision. I've been giving speeches for them, and going around and talking at abundance conferences and such. So I'm all for it. I just think they need to come to grips with the fact that we need an operating system that empowers officials to make the trade-off judgments about putting the power line through the forest or whatever.
Is that you're making it seem as if it's just a legal issue? So I take your point of the example of compliance. Is that all it requires? A few changes in the nature of the law? Well,
it's not a few changes. It would be a change on the same order as abandoning the philosophy of laissez-faire in the progressive era and going to the progressive era, where we have government oversight. It's abandoning the philosophy of legal micromanagement and rebuilding an operating system where people can actually be held accountable instead of pounding the table for their rights.
Come back to politics. My sense is it requires a political wrapper, maybe another Teddy Roosevelt, for example. Where's this going to come from? It's not enough just to have a few legal reforms. There needs to be a philosophy, a wrapping that will inspire people.
That's correct. And there is no narrative right now of what I'm talking about. Well, actually, it's not true. The abundance guys are starting a narrative. They have a narrative. We need more. And I'm trying to add to that by saying, yes, and here's how you get more. But ultimately, political leaders are lagging indicators. You can't go into Congress and convince somebody to say what I'm saying. They'll have their head handed to them by their...
But Gavin Newsom could say it, couldn't he?
Yeah, maybe. I mean, I'm friendly with a bunch of Democratic, political leaders in Congress and governors. I was talking to another Democratic governor the other day. He said, Trump's disruption is actually quite helpful because it allows us to rethink things. but he said there's no vision about how to change it. And what he needs, and I think what Newsom needs as well, is a movement that congeals not only around, quote, abundance or whatever, but congeals around an operating philosophy that allows the simplification and gives back to people, gives back to officials the authority to make, decisions.
Josh, not Josh.
Josh Shapiro.
Benjamin Applebaum has an interesting piece in the Times today about Josh Shapiro, the Pennsylvania governor. Is he perhaps a model for you, Philip?
Oh, it's fantastic. I mean, the highway falls down. It's going to take 12 months to rebuild at least. They waive all the regulations. They just start making executive decisions on the spot to rebuild this fallen section of I-95, and it reopens 12 days later. Yeah, that's the way it ought to work.
So he's an example, Shapiro. He should be the one who can somehow put this. It requires almost a philosophy, doesn't it?
Yes, it's a shift in philosophy. I'm saying it's operating philosophy, though it's not policy. It's how can we make government work again? How can we make it accountable again? And so I'm working with some of the leading figures in Defense Department procurement about changing procurement rules. So instead of having, years of process before you can give a contract, you have a review body after the fact, what a lawyer would call ex post review. You can have weeks of review afterwards, replacing 5 years of process before.
The Applebaum New York Times piece, the headline is Mandami isn't the future of the Democrats. This guy is Josh Shapiro. What do you make of Mandami? Does he have any positive ideas, or is he, again, digging a deeper hole? Is he the left-wing version of Trump?
Well, first, he like Trump is a symptom. So, which do you prefer, MAGA or Mandami? Either way, it's polarizing. Right?
I'm guessing. I mean, I certainly would prefer Mandami. I don't know about you.
I don't prefer either one.
You think they're as bad as each other? There's a moral equivalency between the two?
No, I don't want to go there. I mean, Trump is.
Well, you just suggested that they're as bad as each other, Philip.
Oh, okay, I take it back.
So Trump's worse than Mandami. I mean, you're a New Yorker and you're probably a wealthy one. I'm assuming you're probably going to have to pay at least in part for Mandami's success.
I wish him every success. He's charming. He has fresh ideas. He is an incredibly gifted politician. And I think he could do a lot of good stuff. I happen to think his policies are probably counterproductive, the ones he campaigned on. But I think the underlying issues of affordability and such are real, and I think they do need to be addressed, and they haven't been. But for example, one of the issues I'm involved in is trying to make government services more efficient in New York. So I'm actually working on a white paper as we speak about what the level of the inefficiency is in the operations of the MTA and the operations of various sanitation department and such. Well, the level of inefficiency conservatively is between the level of maybe 30 and 50% because they're unmanageable. That's a huge amount of money that could be used by someone like Mandami for the kinds of things he wants to make the city more affordable, but he hasn't gotten there.
Yeah, I mean, the Dunkelman book, I know, also writes in great detail about Madison Square Gardens and the failure of the redevelopment of the train system and all the rest of it. I come to New York a lot and I travel around the world. I mean, it's all very well having some reforms to the law, Philip, but how do you rebuild the the New York subway system to make it a 21st century rather than an early 20th century system?
Well, I'm not an expert on the subways. I do have friends who have run the subway system. And one of the things you need to do is to make it manageable. And the other thing you need to do is you need to be able to give contracts that are commercially reasonable. So that the Second Avenue subway, which was a new extension, cost $2.5 billion per mile, which happened to be 5 times what a similar subway using the same machine in Paris, France cost. France is not known for its efficient labor rules. And so if you look at what the reasons for that are, there are a bunch of reasons, there's not one, but one of them was labor requirements written into law that required many times the number of employees running the machine as were needed. Well, you've got to get rid of that. That's just burning taxpayer money.
Yeah, and we know that in California. I mean, the Abundance book, of course, focuses on the complete catastrophe of the high-speed rail project between San Francisco and Los Angeles, and compares it to the astonishing success in China of building high-speed rail. Where's the revolution going to come from, Philip? We definitely need one. In a couple of weeks, I've got my old friend Chris Matthews coming back on the show. He has a new book out, Lessons from Bobby, 10 Reasons Robert F. Kennedy Still Matters. RFK went to your law school, UVA, but he never really was a lawyer. Do you think someone, maybe Shapiro is an example of this, to achieve this, we need someone kind of rooted in law, but isn't a lawyer? Maybe you said, you noted that you worked for Clinton and Gore. Clinton was too much of a lawyer. Do you think to achieve what you're calling for in America in terms of a political revolution, we need someone who understands the law, but isn't a lawyer?
Well, or is it someone who understands the law and doesn't treat the law as a state of nature? I mean, law is a man-made object. The test of law is whether it works. Hamilton has this great quote at one point that said basically, an ill-functioning government, whatever be the theory, is necessarily a bad government. So we have an ill-functioning government where, student scores are going down in the schools, infrastructure can't get built or it costs twice as much as it should, et cetera. And so that's a function of a legal system that doesn't let the people with responsibility, have the agency that goes along with that. And so we do need a leader who understands that we need a shift in philosophy, not to do what conservatives say, not to get rid of government, but to make it work. And I think it's probably a centrist Democrat, like Josh Shapiro.
Yeah. RFK Jr., of course, is particularly conspiratorial and distrustful, the son of Robert F. Kennedy. You've mentioned trust earlier. How do we rebuild trust? It seems to be a chicken and egg problem. Philip, where do we recover or rediscover the trust that will enable a trust in government to rebuild the can-do spirit in America? I don't know where we begin.
Well, I would say that the current political situation led by Trump is designed for distrust. He is getting ahead by selling distrust. And the Democratic Party, by and large, is responding, which is understandable, by saying distrust Trump, which is a perfectly reasonable thing to do. So you need someone who actually wants to bring people together, who honors pluralism. We all don't have to agree the same. The Mormons go to Utah, the Swedes go to Minnesota, the Hasidic Jews are in Brooklyn, the techies are all in the Silicon Valley. Great. Let us all have somewhat different values and find our own communities. But ultimately, you're never going to rebuild a system of trust if you don't have a system of authority, because it becomes a free-for-all and people yelling on social media at each other and getting angry, and no one putting stakes in the ground and saying, at this school, these are our values and these are our standards, and I, the principal, am going to do my best to uphold them, or at this university, or in this government agency. And we don't have anyone doing that now. But if you look at if you had a quiz, you say, who in America has moral authority today? Name them.
Well, let's end, Philip, with two visions from you. You don't seem to believe that the American century is definitely closed, although it seems in your mind that there is a danger of this. Two visions of America, say by 2075, 50 years' time, where it will be if we can revive the spirit, and if we don't, what it will be like in 50 years' time?
Yeah, I think the gloomy part is that we have people trudging through large institutions, a kind of slightly less bad version of maybe a combination of Huxley and where everybody's being told what to do, and Orwell with occasional Big Brother coming in, and people finding meaning in their private lives but don't have a sense of ownership for their community, for their society. That's a really bad place to be. And that's a place where America is weak.
In other words, halfway between Brave New World and 1984.
Yes. And America will be weak, and the autocrats, Putin and Xi and the others, will just laugh as we sit there in a scrum on the playground arguing about who gets to swim in the swimming meet, and years to build anything or whatever. I mean, we've got this dysfunctional society.
So in this world, lawyers will still be all right. They'll still be making.
Oh, lawyers will be everywhere.
Maybe we should just shut the law schools, Philip. Would that be one solution?
Well, I do think you need lawyers to rebuild this, but I've been trying to convince the people who run the American Law Institute to take this on as a serious challenge of a modern society, because I don't think it's really a free society anymore.
And this dystopian vision that you present of America being by 2075 halfway between Brave New World and 1984, is it more or less likely with AI?
I actually think AI can be used for good or ill. It's an unbelievably powerful tool. If one of the reasons we have all this process that doesn't get anything is because of distrust. AI could be an enormous tool, not to make decisions, but to validate decisions. So I actually think AI could be a tool of trust if used in the right way.
And finally, a sunnier vision of America in 2075. If people read your book and we get a Josh Shapiro or some sort of equivalent of Teddy Roosevelt in the next few years, if we can revive the spirit of America, what will it look like by 2075?
Long before that. It would take less than a decade to do what I'm saying. You said the basic theme is let Americans roll up their sleeves and act like Americans again. So let's create hierarchies of authority that are accountable. Everybody's accountable, for the schools, for the infrastructure. Let's start acting. Let's move forward. Let's adapt when things don't work. And I think the American spirit is still alive and well in people's soul. It's just that there's no leader who's trying to kind of harness it towards things. So we do need new leaders. We need a movement. We need Keen On to be right on the case.
Oh, yeah. Well, I think maybe if I was American, I'd run for president, but I can't. So maybe we'll have Josh Shapiro instead, Philip.
Well, maybe, and that would be good.
Well, congratulations on the book. Always an honor to talk to such a distinguished writer. The new book is called Saving Can Do, How to Revive the Spirit of America by Philip K. Howard. Thank you so much, Philip.
Great to be with you, Andrew.